On behalf of the Roanoke Island Historical Association, we'd like to welcome you tonight, part of the Land of Beginnings Festival. This week-long festival was created to sort of discover who we are and celebrate who we are as a community. And it's been a wonderful week so far. We have a few more activities to look into your program. We hope that you will participate. Tonight, we have an absolutely wonderful night. I see some of you were here last night, or at Festival Park, I should say, where we had a wonderful evening of some stories from some Outer Banks originals. And here we have some more great stories to be told tonight. So, on behalf of the Roanoke Island Historical Association and the Land of Beginnings Committee, we'd like to thank Penny Couch, Lisa Griggs, Ernie Foster, and Biff Jennings for being with us tonight. The moderator tonight will be Horace Whitfield, who is the Executive Director of the Elizabethan Gardens in Manio. So thank you for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure.
And with no further ado, on with the show.
Thank you, Carl. I want to add to Carl's welcome to all of you tonight. It is good to see many of the faces that we saw last night, and we know that tonight is a different night, and tonight is a special night as well, because even though many of us are here, was anyone not at the session last night? Anybody missed the session last night? Well, we've got a good agenda tonight, because we don't have one other than to ask these folks to share part of their lives. Last night I asked the folks who were there, I guess basically what I did was to challenge them to tell the truth. I don't think that I'm going to do that tonight. But I know that being here at the site of the first powered flight, shortly after our 100th anniversary, really does set, again, we're in another historic setting that certainly lends itself to one of the examples of the history that we're here to celebrate. But we're all aware that without people involved in that history, we wouldn't be here. And so it is not only the events of history, but the people who create them that are that fascinating part. And that's why we're here tonight, to honor the stories that people remember, and the stories that deserve to be told, and those that deserve to be heard. I have to admit that as we were preparing for the anniversary of powered flight, some circumstances in my life were causing me to be a little bit bored with the Outer Banks. And that was about the time that I started flying and looking at the Outer Banks in a perspective that was different than I had seen the Outer Banks in the 30 years that I had lived here. So I got excited about this place all over again. And I hope that when you folks leave tonight, you'll have a bit more of that excitement that you already have, that sometimes needs to be renewed and rejuvenated. And I know that as you attend the events of this week, that that will be very much part of what is going on there too, as all of our partners and individuals across this county and from other areas of the state recognize this as the land of beginnings. We're really fortunate because we've got a good geographical representation here. We were reminded from the audience last night that the mainland is also a part of Dare County, and I thought to myself, well, that sounds like something a Hatterisman would say. But we've got Lisa, whose family hails from Currituck County, and a couple of Hatterismen here, and Biff, I'm not sure of what your origins are, but
I'm a newbie.
Well, then since you and I have been adopted by this area, then I'm just going to call on you first to tell us a little bit about maybe what this place means to you, and what your sense of telling a story is all about.
Tough order. Let's see what we can do. About 20 years ago, well, 25 years ago, I started vacationing down here. And Outer Banks time was a different kind of time than normal people keep back then, and it sort of is now. You kind of got up when you got up, and you kind of went to work when you felt like it, and if the blues were running, you didn't bother to go to work at all. And quite often you'd go up to a store thinking, well, I'll go in there and get a submarine, and I'd go sit on the beach and eat and have myself a good time. But that fella had done discovered the fish were running before I got there, and so there was a note up saying closed until the blues leave. And that was pretty predominant out here, and sometimes you just see a note and it would say, help yourself. Well, I'd go on back home to Kentucky where I was running an electronics business and newly married, and we'd look at each other and go, why did we come back here? 2 weeks of the year we're spending at the beach, one in spring, one in fall, and driving all that ways and working all that hard to come down here when our soul belongs down there. So one time we came down, and that car didn't want to go north, and that car didn't want to go west. My wife didn't want to go north, and she didn't want to go west. I kind of agreed. So that's how we ended up as Outer Bankers, was we just stayed. And I got to say, I haven't regretted that a single day. Now, I have a little bit of a story about Outer Banks time that kind of ties up some of the group up here by a strange coincidence. When I first moved down here, there was this cute little girl ran a photography store over on the beach road, and I went kind of sneaking around her door looking for a job, and Lisa didn't have a job for me. So I went over to Jim Lee's place and went looking for a job, and because he didn't have Lisa, Jim had a job for me. Now, I don't know if any of you know Jim Lee, but Jim Lee is one of the great storytellers of all time. And he could stretch something out for about a week and a half, and you'd enjoy every darn minute of it. And another one that was right up his alley was your daddy. And Ray was a great guy. And at one time, the two of them owned a newspaper out here together, and they were great friends. But sometimes great friends know each other way too well. So one day, not long after I moved into Jim's camera house, I see this old Volvo station wagon creep through the parking lot and go on. About half an hour later, it come through again, and it went on. And then Jim decided he was hungry and got himself across the street to get something to eat. And here come that Volvo wagon again. Ray comes in, comes up to the counter, and says, how's my buddy Jim doing? And he drove all the way up from Hatteras to go to the doctor or something, and he'd done that, and he'd been orbiting that parking lot waiting on that white van to leave. And I said, well, he's right across the street. You can go ask him yourself. He says, no, I'm only here for the day. And I'll remember that for the rest of my life. Your daddy is a good man.
Well, Lisa, speaking of Jim and cameras, you're a photographer as well. And I know that you've had a unique view of your home and of the Outer Banks. But I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about your family and your roots. I know that you mentioned that you had some family who had come tonight because they knew that you were here.
It was really a great surprise to see them again, and I look forward to spending more time. It's been like 25 years since I've seen them, so it's really great to see you this evening. And I look forward to coming by and spending more time with you.
Well, I don't want to stop your story, but I have to tell you, I think that's very important because I can remember having being on the agenda with a couple of gubernatorial candidates back in the 80s, and I was really proud of that achievement. But at the same time, I had been invited to speak at a family reunion, and my sense was that, you know, when people recognize you, it's one thing, but when your family recognizes you, you know you've made it. So I want to compliment you on that, Lisa.
Thank you very much. You know, of all the things growing up here on the Outer Banks, I had the best of both worlds, the ocean for the front yard and the sound for my backyard. And there wasn't a moment when it was warm weather that I didn't hesitate getting into the water, whether it was swimming, water skiing, or surfing. He would talk about the second best pastime of the Outer Banks, surfing. If the surf was up, we didn't go to work. But I had, with my cousins, and I have just so many wonderful cousins I grew up with. And the older cousins, of course, would always try to keep a hand on us. We were somewhat a little bit out of control, but we never got lost in Point Harbor, that a cousin wouldn't turn us around and say, go home. We knew what everybody's kitchen looked like, and we could find the refrigerator really quick. I grew up with 3 brothers, and they were all boys. They basically, I would play games, and all the kids, all the cousins would end up in our front yard. And I'd be the one hiking the football and running just as quick as I could before one of them would tackle me. But I kind of grew up being a little bit of a tomboy. I had many great memories of going soft shell crabbing along the sounds. The best thing was to go hunting with my brother. I don't know if that was the best thing. It was really scary sometimes. But my dad used to tell us of his adventures when he was growing up. And one thing about my grandparents, Annalise and James, they had this strict that you were up at the crack of dawn out in the field and you didn't come back in until the sun went down. And they did this anywhere from 5 to 6 days a week, never on Sunday. Sunday was God's day, and that was the day that you went and gave your blessings and thanks for everything that God gave you. And Curritucket wasn't that easy as far as the farming. They worked very hard, and as things came along, this was the days before the bridge. And my father would tell stories about how he and my Uncle Brantley would swim if they had to across the Currituck Sound over to Kitty Hawk Bay so they could go play ball with the Beechams and the Perrys. And when they didn't really fill up the swimming, they would take the ferry over. And this was about 1920s. And this particular day, they didn't want to swim over, so James and Brantley caught the ferry. Mr. Bill Perry was the captain, and they looked up, and here comes Sam Twyford, Sr. Now, everybody would, if you don't know Sam Twyford, he had the funeral home here on the Outer Banks, and his business at that time was located over in Elizabeth City. So if somebody was unfortunate enough to pass away in your family, he would come take the body over to Elizabeth City, prepare the body, and then bring it back to your home. And it wasn't that you went to the Twyford's funeral home, you went actually to the person who passed away's home. And they would set the body in the casket in either the living room or a special room that had been cleared out just so that you could go in and view the body. Well, he rode up on his truck up onto the ferry, and my uncle and father looked and they were like, oh, they knew who it was on the back of that truck. So they became, of course, very solemn. As the event went on, they were halfway across the Currituck Sound, and if any of you have been out in the Currituck Sound in the middle of summer, you know that crop-up storms hit. And when they hit with high winds, torrential rain, and they are just the scariest things to be in the middle of a sound when one of those has got you by the tail. It grabbed that ferry, and evidently the ferries didn't have very strong powered engines at that point. When it grabbed that ferry, it basically had twisted and turned it, and before they knew what was happening, that casket had slipped right off the back of that truck and went into the Currituck Sound. Before Sam Twyford could realize what in the world he was going to do, that cop just started taking on water, and it started sinking. And Dad and Uncle Brantley looked, and they jumped overboard, and immediately they muscled that casket back up on top of the ferry. Well, it didn't. The wind was still quite actively blowing, and it was still raining. Everybody was drenched. Captain Perry was looking like, oh my God. And by the time they had put secure so it wouldn't go back overboard, the storm had released them. They were all the way past Harbinger, and that was just several miles from the original destination. So, and of course, Sam Twyford leans over and he goes, boys, I'm going to need your help. Brantley and James looked at each other like, what do you want us to do now? He says, well, I got to get this casket. You got to get the body out so it can dry. I can't deliver this poor man to his family soaking sopping wet. We were like, well, what do you want us to do? And Dad was like, this would be a good time to start swimming. But they got the body out. They laid the body down. And of course, Sam was very concerned that the wind might just start whipping again and he'd lose the body. So he had this rope that Captain Perry had given him, and he tied the body very securely to this mast sort of pole that was on the ferry so that the body could dry properly. Of course, my dad and Uncle Brantley were like, oh, Lord. Then he said that he asked them to help him dump the water out of the casket, and he was doing everything he could to dry this casket out. The sun came out, and the body did dry somewhat also for the casket. But they'd gotten, by the time they'd gotten back around to make their approach to Kitty Hawk Bay, they were quickly reloading the casket and putting it back on the back of Mr. Twyford's truck. And of course, the minute that ferry hit the sand or where they would launch out, he said that my Uncle Brantley and Father were, all you could see were the heels of their shoes. They had taken the body up to the house, and in those days, sometimes the body would sit for the viewing at the home, so the family and friends could come pay their respects for as much as a week. And this particular family called in 3 days and said, we're all out in the yard now. We can't go into the house. Do you think you could come now? And let's go ahead and send him to the family cemetery. Sam said he beat it on over there, and they had an early funeral. And everybody was like really very much happy that it went as well as it did. So he recalled on his way out, as he was going back over to the ferry docks, he would see my uncle and James out there playing ball, and they would turn and look at us like, they would like try everything they could to hide. But they said that from that point on, Daddy did try to stick to as much swimming as he could. But they invited the Beechams and the Perrys over to play in Point Harbor more often. So that was kind of one of the best. And I always got a kick out. I was like, how could you swim a sound? It's 3.5 miles, y'all, from Point Harbor over to Kitty Hawk. And my daddy used to challenge, he could swim the English Channel, and I'm like, oh my God. But you know, you think about what time you have and how much you want to grab as much fun in that time. And they sure did. Between those two, they were very, very unbelievable characters. And everybody's got even more stories that they would tell me about my father and uncle. But that was one of my favorite stories.
Well, we're going to, thanks for that story, Lisa. We're going to come back and let you tell one or two more if there's time. I want to move to Danny and invite you to tell us what, and I'm just going to ask you, Danny, who are some of the people that you feel like have influenced you in your life and what you love to do now?
Absolutely, Horace. My daddy was from Chapel Hill, and I'm not a native. I'm a newbie too in that respect, but Hatteras is the only home I've ever known. I'm 47 years old. I've lived there for 45 years. I run a little tour business down there, but everything that I learned, all these stories that I tell these people from points all over the country are things that I stole from the old timers. I used to love to go sit, even, as 10, 11, 12 years old, sit on the porches and talk with these guys. My buddies are going, the surf's good, and, they're catching puppy drum and stuff. Well, I'll be out there pretty soon. Mr. Lauren here is telling me about, what it was like when his father was was cooking out there at the Fessenden Center, and there was that Edison feller, and then that Marconi feller, and Fessenden and all those fellas out there, and just some of the stories that were going on were just amazing. I remember being about 8 years old. My daddy had an open Jeep, one of these old Willis military Jeeps, and Daddy used to take us boys riding along the beach, or we'd go down Open Pines Road. And a fellow named Richard Daly went along with us one day. He was nearing the end of his life. Richard Daly was highly intelligent. He had been educated in Atlanta. His grandfather was B.B. Daly, the famous lifesaver. B.B. Daly and his crew received 7 of 12 gold life-saving medals ever issued in the first 30 years of the life-saving service for the rescue they did of the Ephraim Williams in Christmas time, 1884. But I remember sitting in the back of that Jeep sucking on a Kickapoo Joy Juice, or the forerunner of Mountain Dew. And Daly, introspective Daly, was talking about being at the Hatteras Weather Station, which has just been restored by the Park Service. They did a marvelous job. It's next to Burris Red and White Supermarket in Hatteras. But Daly and a gentleman named Horace Gaskins were manning the weather station telegraph. It was April 14th, 1912, a Sunday evening. They're sitting there 11:45 our time, 15 minutes to midnight, 10:45 Labrador time, when the initial SOS, called a CQD at that time, came in from the Titanic. We'd all heard the hype about this was the finest ship afloat. I remember Richard Daly saying, we all read all the stories. It used to be years ago that the Monday paper was the big paper. Now it's the Sunday paper. But, granted, we didn't get it until Thursday, but we still knew the hype about the Titanic. It was a story. It was the, Tom Cruise, Katie Holmes baby story of, 1912. But I remember him saying, you could see the hurt in his eyes. He said, we sent that message up to New York. We were immediately reprimanded for cluttering the lines with foolishness. And we were accused by the man who went on to found RCA and had an interest in General Electric of drinking on duty. But I still remember him pulling his hat off and looking down in the floorboard. He said if they'd listened to Horace and I, they'd have saved several hundred more lives. And as the time would go on, stories like that would just knock me out. There's so much history down there, and us being local people, we take it for granted. And folks, it's dying. It's going out very quickly. Captain Murney here, I know what you must be thinking. Here's a longtime Hattersman, probably 8th generation Hattersman here. These 2 guys from Hatteras. They can't be from Hatteras. They've got shoes on, for one. But, Captain Murnell, Ernie's father, was just a master storyteller, and he was at the point where he would save his punchline there toward the very end. And some of the stories they would tell were fantastic. But these things are dying out, and I salute Carl and the organizers there at the Roanoke Island Historical Association for preserving this stuff. Once a year is just, not enough. That's true. I got a quick story here I wanted to tell you. One of the old timers I used to like to talk to was a man named Charlie Gray. He was a Kinnikeeter. Kinnikit is an Algonquian Indian term that means that which is mixed. And the old timers down there say that name comes from the chief Indian down there, King Kinnikit, who did the talking when John Lawson, landed there in 1701. John Lawson was the surveyor general for the Lords Proprietors. We were not yet a royal colony. We were a business interest of 8 friends of the King of England, Lord Anson, Lord Carteret, Lord Collington, Lord Grenville, Lord Granville, all these guys. And a lot of people had been moving off the mainland because the Indians were on the warpath. And they came and settled over in Hatteras Island there because they knew the area could support life. But Lawson ended up writing a story for a book he wrote and published in 1709. And this is what he had to say. He said, "I was shocked and amazed to find ye Hatteras Indians with light complexions and gray eyes." In other words, got these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians out there. What's up with that? But Lawson was one of the first people to put forth the theory that at least some of the lost colonists settled in down there in Hatteras with the Indian Mantios people. But Charlie Gray told me it was about 2 weeks before he died, and he was bedridden, and I would go over there and sit with him. And I remember him telling me about when he was a young boy. If you've ever been over to Ocracoke lately, you may have seen those pilings on the north end of Ocracoke Island. And what that was a wharf. This was the only fueling station between Morehead City and Hampton Roads for these Coast Guard float planes and the United States Navy float planes and the Army Air Corps. But any of you guys who know what motorized things were like back then, there was no such thing as a muffler. They were god-awful loud. And you had these 17, 18-year-old boys who had never left the island but had made up the the Coast Guard and the services and stuff out there. They were already hard of hearing. It's like they'd stood in front of a bunch of speakers at a bar listening to rock and roll bands here today, but all their hearing was shot. But Charlie told me about a gentleman by the name of Charles Lindbergh, we all know from the Spirit of St. Louis, first solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927. Well, in 1933, Lindbergh and 9 lieutenants had 5 float planes, these very loud Haas float planes, very big things. These weren't the little float planes we see now. These were big boys. But they were mapping the coast for the U.S. Geodetic Survey for the Army Air Corps. And Charles Lindbergh was an international celebrity. He was a big deal. And they came landing there with those float planes there at Hatteras Island to refuel so they could make their way to Hampton Roads. But see, Lindbergh, despite his status in the world community, he liked to hunt and he liked to fish. And he knew all about Hatteras Island. And sure enough, the engineer over there at the Coast Guard station on the Ocracoke side, it was called the Hatteras Inlet Station, although it was on the Ocracoke side, he sent over for his grandmother and his aunt just to whip up a feast for Charles Lindbergh and these 9 lieutenants. And they had a bang-up meal, and after the meal was over, they all retired there to the main room and for brandy and cigars. And any of you who know anything about Charles Lindbergh, you know how soft-spoken he was. He was a tall man, very intelligent, but he just had a real soft voice. And these Kinnikeet boys who were manning the station down there, they were, the scrubs having to carry all the heavy stuff, and they were way down low on the Coast Guard order there. But they had a chance to talk to Lindbergh. And Charlie told me about his uncle, who was only 17 years old, barefooted, never been anywhere in his life, and he was already hard of hearing. Even his grandmother had to yell at him. And he's sitting there, and he even though Mr. Gray had understood the concept of flying, he was not sold on it altogether. And what really tripped his trigger was the fact that not only could these things fly, but they could float too. And he kind of had a hard time trying to judge the two. Are you a boat or are you a plane? You can't be both. And Colonel Lindbergh was like, I assure you, son, it can do both. So he said, well, tell me something, Colonel there, with all due respect, sir. He apologized. I'm going to give my best Hatteras accent here. What are you going to do in that float plane there? And you get way up in the air. I mean, you get way up top, way up high in the air, and the motor quits. And you're in that float plane there. What you going to do? And Lindbergh, in his calm voice, said, well, son, I guess I'd have to bail out. And Mr. Gray said, great God, man, bail her out? What, does she leak? But anyway, coming up on the Organ Inlet Bridge tonight, I saw a trawler going underneath Organ Inlet Bridge, and his name was Bailey Boy. And that's what they called Mr. Gray until his dying day. He said, oh, to have that day back again. That's a Hatteras story for you.
Thank you, Danny. A great story. Captain Murney, I have always, and, you know, I took one of your courses, captain's course, many years ago, and I've always admired the character of the fleet, of the Albatross fleet, because to me it represents a bygone day, but you still keep that day alive. And I'd like for you, if you will, just to tell us some of the origins of that fleet and of the vessels that comprise it and of the people that you have known that have kept it working.
Okay, try to do that. First of all, you talk about it as being a piece of history, and then I come up here and I feel kind of honored, and you put me in a rocking chair, and I'm trying to work every day, and I'm not sure this is a good plan. In looking, I guess, a little bit about how I happen to be here, I'm not sure. In that, you know, I grew up on Hatteras. All of my grandparents were born on Hatteras Island. And my mother was a midget from the Waves area. My father was in Hatteras. And though I didn't have anything to do with this, my great-grandfather was Rasmus Midget of life-saving fame. In looking at the fleet, my father, as a young man, decided he was going to leave the island. He was going to go to Long Island, join the Coast Guard, served for a couple of years as a life-saving service at the time. And then he was going to become a plumber. Thank God for the Depression. Otherwise, I would be a plumber's son from Long Island. When the Depression came on, he moved back to Hatteras and went to work. Now, my grandfather had 4 sons and a 32-foot commercial boat, the traditional round stern boats. So you had 5 men on one boat, and that's a couple of men too many. So my father decided that he was going to have a boat built on his own. He also had decided that he was going to look at this hook and line fishing that the people were talking about. There were a significant number of wealthy sportsmen who had bought up large chunks of the Outer Banks for hunting clubs. And in addition to their gunning, some of them were looking for guides to take them sport fishing. And my father thought this might be a good idea. And I only thought about this a couple of years ago, that my father was about 23 when this notion hit him. And he thought that rather than commercial fish first and then charter fish, that he would make his commitment to the charter fishing and then fill in the blank spots with commercial fishing. So he, at 24, he went to Buffalo City. Everyone knows where Buffalo City is. Show of hand, no lying. Some of you. Just go to East Lake and turn south. He went to Buffalo City and brought back a bunch of Atlantic white cedar juniper and set it up in the yard and cured it out for over a year. And while he was doing this, he went about the business of looking for someone to build him a boat. And he went to a couple of local boat builders in Hatteras, and at the time all the boats were the traditional round stern boats, and there's a reason for the round stern, and that is for commercial fishing. When you have to pull your nets by hand, it makes great sense for a variety of reasons. 2 men stand up on that platform, 2 more stood behind them in the boat and picked the fish as the 2 men pulled it. The stern juts side in such a manner that the net is not as likely to get into the prop. In addition to that, with the Ryan stern, you pull the boat back into the waves, and the waves just go by you with very little resistance and no splash up on the boat. All the boats were built that way. That either started down in Khorasan or it started in Hatteras, who knows. At any rate, my father wanted a boat with a little more flair and more curves and just a little bit bigger than the traditional boat. And I was thinking about that the other day. I was talking with someone. I said, that sounds just like a young man, doesn't it? So, at any rate, nobody in Hatteras would build it his way. And if you ever met my father, he was a very mild-mannered, soft-spoken individual and never aggressive, or at least in my lifetime he wasn't. But what he did have was an absolute iron will. So he was going to have that boat built his way. So he went down to Khorasan, which, as a matter of fact, I was down there this past weekend with the boat, celebrating its 70th birthday, and with the family of the people that built it. So he goes to Khorasan, he goes to 2 more builders down there, and they would build him a boat, but they wanted to do it their way, not so much his way. And finally he finds a man. I guess what clinched the deal was simply, it's my wood, it's my idea. If it doesn't work, it's my fault. Do we have a deal? And like I said, the boat celebrated its 70th birthday, so it worked. He brings the boat home, and the folks in the village said his boat is just too big. Well, we're still going. I've been painting on it today, as a matter of fact. Anyway, simply put, that's how it got started. The war came on. The boat served in the war. She was in the Coast Guard in Morehead City. Once the war ended, it's back in business. Business is booming in Hatteras. He has another boat built. In 1951, my father personally caught and landed the marlin that really started marlin fishing off this coast. Aycock Bryan and my father, pretty good friends. Aycock was pushing stories. He'd recently been hired by the county, and he pushed it very well. And things have taken off from there, and we're still humming along. But could I tell you just a little bit about, have any more time to say something about
Sure.
Hatteras? And
Sure, I'd like for you to continue.
a little bit about Hatteras. Now, Hatteras is kind of different. It's not so much different now because we also have ESPN. But when I was a boy, there was no asphalt on Hatteras, no paved roads. When I was real little, they came about very quickly. But when I was real tiny, we lived in a house down a single-lane sand road down at the south part of the village. And in the summertime, those ruts were about yay deep. There were maybe half a dozen cars in the village. And when you're little, walking in ruts is tough, particularly when it's hot. But the thing that I remember most about the house is that when we had storms, in the early 50s, there was a late 40s and early 50s, there was a fairly active hurricane seasons. And now we're all a flutter over hurricanes. And when you're little, you just kind of take your cues from your folks. And when your folks get upset, you get upset. If they act like everything's under control, then you're pretty sure you're under control. So we were having, every time we'd have a storm, the thing that I remember we lived in this 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, hallway through the middle. And under the steps were 2 plugs about this big around, like stoppers. And the houses, unlike now, all the houses in Hatteras, all the local homes were built fairly low. We thought that getting up in the wind and having your house shake every time you had a northeaster was a bad idea. Now it's the right thing to do. The other half of it was that house was built very low to the ground, and the ground in Hatteras is very close to the water. So you had a lot of tide coming in your house. But every time we'd have a storm and the tide would start coming up, once it reached the point where they thought it would come in the house, they'd pull the stoppers. And the point of the stoppers was to let the water in so the house would not float off the blocks. And what I most remembered was that once you got about, say this much water in the house, it didn't shake as much. So you were kind of looking forward to the water coming up in your house to kind of stop the shaking. And that was my first introduction to hurricanes. And I wondered a little bit later why there never seemed to be any sense of concern or urgency, because as kids it was just kind of exciting. The great thing about a storm was that it washes all this stuff up in the edge of the marsh, and after the storm, you just go out and explore, and there's all sorts of good stuff washed up. I mean, it was a great day after a storm. But my father, in later years, was talking about the 33 storm, which was a devastating storm. Washed down all the fish houses in Hatteras and did damage all up and down the coast. And he was 23, and my uncle was 12 at the time. And they were fishing in the family boat, and they were down just a little bit below where the Ocracoke ferry dock is on the Sound side. And my grandfather was in a sail skiff with them, and he said, "Boys, it looks like we're going to have a storm, and we need to go on back." And of course, my father knew better, so he stayed, and the storm came. And there was a clubhouse at the time called, I think, Green Island Clubhouse. So once this storm was on them very strong, he moved the boat kind of into the creek, anchored up best he could. And here's this 23-year-old with his 12-year-old brother, and they made their way to the clubhouse. And I think there were like 5 other people there at the time. And during the course of the night, the sea tide came over, banged into the clubhouse. And by morning, the eaves of the first floor were even with the ground. And it reached a point where they were afraid to stay in it, so they moved out on the roof. And my father says he and his uncle, they were huddled together, but they were close to a chimney, and he keeps thinking, this chimney may fall. And so he moved his brother over, and he said he hadn't changed his position more than 5 minutes, and sure enough, right through the roof where they were sitting goes the chimney. And his other part, the next morning, all of a sudden it's calm. And the boat's washed up in the marsh. So he goes out to start worrying about the boat. And he said just about the time he got there, he looked, and here comes a wall of water. Well, he was in the eye. This was his first experience with the eye of the storm. And he said before he made it back to the club, he starts running. Before he makes it back, he's in waist-deep, chest-deep water, got back in the clubhouse and weathered the rest of the storm. But after having gone through something like that, the notion that you know it's coming and you're prepared for it, there's just no sense of worry and no sense of anxiety. It may have been there, but as far as kids growing up in Hatteras, you just did not feel it, which is part of the reason why the locals just kind of hang in there anyway now. Anyway, there's a couple more hurricane stories in there, but that's good.
Thank you. And Dan?
Horace, can I jump in on that? What Captain Murney was talking about was a little bit of that Hatteras technology. You pull those stoppers out, and that keeps your house from floating away. Nowadays, they got big screen TVs and carpet, but, they had a rocking chair about like this, and there was not a lot at stake when you let the water in. But there's a story about a man named Captain Ike O'Neill. He's actually an Ocracoker. And they were talking about the hurricane of 1899, which was a huge storm. And in the old days, these newspaper writers, they were called traveling writers, they would come out and they would go to exotic locales like the Outer Banks or Hatteras in this case, and they would look out the best old-timer, and that way the stories would come to the residents of Philadelphia or Boston or wherever. And this particular gentleman was with newspaper out of Hartford, Connecticut, I believe it was. And sure enough, he was told to go look up Cap Mike. And Cap Mike was on to this fella, and the writer was asking him about the hurricane of 1899. So he said, yes, I well remember the storm we had here in August of last year, when my dear old dad handed me an axe and said, here, son, scuttle the floor. So I commenced to chopping a hole in the floor to let the water in to keep our house from floating away. And about the time I got about halfway through, boom, the water shot to the ceiling in a huge geyser. And on top of that geyser was a mallard duck that had been trapped underneath of our house. And the chaos which ensued, my dear old pop trying to get that bird ready for the evening pot was more chaos than the storm ever brought to us. But that ran in a northern newspaper.
And to think we could be at home watching TV and watching storm stories, right? Biff,
Well,
I know you've weathered some storms on the Outer Banks, too.
I have weathered a storm or two, and one of my favorite hurricanes, you know, you're a real Outer Banker when you're saying one of my favorite hurricanes was.
Is that ironic or what?
We've been down here, I guess, 8-9 years and bought us a house, and I guess at that point you're pretty much committed, or ought to be anyhow. And Collington was a pretty empty little place back then. Nice neighborhood, great neighborhood, and it was like my perfect dream. I had bass in my front yard, and I had bluefish over here. And I thought I had gone to heaven without all the hard part. This is just a wonderful thing. And then they started talking about, I don't even remember the name. You get to that point where you don't even remember their names anymore, but a 3 was going to come and kick our booties. And we thought about it and thought, well, they've been wrong every time before. It's just been a little thing. But this one started looking like it might be a big thing. Well, the one over there who's got sense in the family started saying, I think it's time for us to leave. And I'm not in the habit of disagreeing with my wife a whole lot, so I said, all right. Well, she's got a friend whose daddy lives over in Williamston, and so we proceed to head over to Williamston and tuck it in over there. And I got in a rocking chair about like this one by the side of the bed and sat there all night long, rocking and rocking and rocking. Because when you live out here and all your stuff's out here, you don't really want to go away and find out about it from Jim Cantori. This is not the man who's settling my fate, Jim Cantori. So my wife over there wakes up, opens one eye and looks at me and says, you're leaving, aren't you? Yep. You want Aaron to go with you? Yep. So I grabbed Aaron, and we headed back to the Outer Banks in spite of the fact that the traffic was going all the other way.
Okay.
Begin to question your sanity a little bit. And we get back to the house, and it's missed us by a good bit. And that wester's come, and the water's starting to come up. And Aaron and I grab our rods and go out and start walking the bulkhead. Because you're a fisherman, this is what you do. And we caught so many bass that day. They were practically jumping over onto the bank. Every time we put a plastic worm in the water, a bass comes out. And we're walking up and down the neighbors' lots, and there's about 3 people in our whole neighborhood had stayed. And they're sitting up there, and you know, a hurricane party's a hurricane party. They're all sitting up on their decks watching and having a good time. I don't think these people ever knew there was bass in their canals until we started removing the bass from their canals. And here Aaron is about this tall, catching all the bass he can possibly stand till his arms are tired. And I'm looking around, and I'm thinking, you know, we ought to have a few more of these things. Of course, that's the last time I said that, but when something turns your fishing on that good, you don't really look a gift horse in the mouth. But the very next hurricane that came along, we all moved our cars up to high ground because, you know, we have cars these days and we worry about them way too much. And not everybody secured everything in the neighborhood. So we stagger back down into the yard, and when we left, there's about yay much water in the yard. And when we get back, there's about yay much water in the yard. And floating up near us is a paddle boat. the neighbor's paddle boat has got free. So Aaron gets in the paddle boat and starts puttering around the yard. And I got a picture of him out there at the mailbox checking the mail from his paddle boat. And if that picture blows away in the next hurricane, it doesn't matter. I still got that picture of my son in a paddle boat in the front yard checking the mail.
You know, I haven't weathered any great storms here on the Outer Banks. We've been fortunate since the '62 storm, the Ash Wednesday storm, that we haven't had a great deal of damage here on the northern banks. The Hatteras Island and areas to the south have certainly not been as fortunate in recent years. So I don't have those personal experiences here in this part of the county that some have had in recent years. But I do get that sense of foreboding because I didn't grow up on the island with parents like Ernie did, who were accustomed to that and knew that as a way of life. But I do remember a couple of experiences. One, just briefly, when I was working as a landscape contractor, had a landscape contracting business, I remember dealing with some clients in Southern Shores. They were right in that Soundview section. And I had been watching the weather and watching this March storm come up the coast and knew that we were going to get something off of it, but I don't think any of us really realized the extent of the damage that it would rack. But I can remember taking this couple out and riding them around the neighborhood to look at some jobs that I had done. And as we came back, the wind was starting to lift, and that time it was gusting 45. And they had a brand new house, and as we came back, the sand was drifting. The lady was looking at shingles lifting off of her house. They were trying to determine where they were going to find the money for the job. And as we were there in the living room, she was nearly hysterical as the wind started piping up, as those barges started drifting across Currituck Sound. That was the toughest contract I ever got a signature on.
Welcome to the Outer Banks, lady.
But I left with the contract and a deposit. I think that the storm that I remember the most, though, is Gloria. And she's one that passed over Ocracoke Island and came up the banks. And I remember that storm because we were in Beaufort with the Elizabeth II, and she was on her maiden voyage. And where we had had a crew of 25 who brought the ship down, when the word came that the storm was coming and she was headed to Beaufort, then when Captain Les Hooper, who became a good friend and mentor, was a mentor and good friend of mine, Captain Les was running ferries across Oregon Inlet when I was 3 years old. So when I hooked on to him, I soaked up everything that he had to teach me just like a sponge. But Captain Les came up, and I had 2 staff members and a volunteer. And he looked at me and said, "Where's your crew?" And I said, "Here they are." And those days the ship didn't have an engine, so we tied up along the tug, and he took us up into Adams Creek. And we anchored there on a mooring that was set there for barges to hang on to when they were in transit. And and we were the first ones out of Beaufort. They had ordered all the boats out. And as the day went on, there were other boats that came out, had anchored around us, and a number of landing craft, a large number of Army landing craft that were coming and anchoring up because that was the best hurricane hole in the area, north end of Adams Creek. And we were right in a bend in the channel before it narrows. We got a call that day, because in those days, that was before cell phones, mid-'80s, 85. And we got a call from the bridge tender. One of my bosses in Raleigh had had the foresight to know that the bridge tender had a phone and he had a VHF radio and he could communicate with us. So he called us, the bridge tender called us on the radio and said that he had my boss on the line from Raleigh. He wanted us to abandon ship. And so I looked around. I didn't see a limousine up on the bank, so I said, well, you tell him that we're just going to get on the tug and we're going to watch the ship from the tug. And so I reported to him the souls that were on board, and we secured the ship and we strung a line back to the tug, and we got on the tug Albemarle and we stood watch on the tug Albemarle into the evening. As the storm started blowing hurricane force and was gusting up to 90, as it began to pass Beaufort and head up the banks, the wind shifted to the northwest, and we had been listening to the reservists who were on board these landing craft. They were doing a lot of talking to each other. Some of them were praying over the radio. We were looking at the radar, seeing some of these boats drifting ashore and getting washed up into the marsh. And one of them got underway, one of these landing craft got underway, headed upwind because apparently as the wind shifted, their single anchor was dragging. And he went just dead to windward of us, dropped his anchor, and we saw him slowly sliding back to us, coming down the channel. And now I mentioned to you, we were right at the bend of the channel, and he was sliding right down that channel, coming right at us. Well, Captain Les got on the radio, started hollering, "You gonna take out my ship?" Started blowing the danger signal, searchlight. He did everything he could. No word from the captain of the landing craft. And as it started coming down on us, it looked like a city. That big house came so close. And just as he got to the bend in that channel, his anchor bit and he stopped about 50 yards from the ship. There I was, pulling on my boots, pulling on my oilskins. I looked at Captain Les and I said, "What can I do?" He said, "Son," he said, "times like this, there's just nothing you can do." And I'll remember that night, just as I remember Captain Les for the rest of my life. But that was quite a storm and quite an experience for us. But we were the first ones to make it back to the dock in Beaufort after that storm. We passed by boats that had been washed up under the bridge, had been dismasted, had been skewered on pilings, and we came in to Beaufort. That rain had just washed us clean. We were looking just as pretty as that ship had ever looked. We had seen some National Guard helicopters hovering around us as we approached. And when we got back to the dock, we were greeted by Governor Jim Martin, who handed us a box of a dozen roses and a card inside that I still have that said, "Congratulations on your good seamanship." So we passed him our bow line. He secured us to the dock. Governor Martin was a sailor. And of course, Captain Les, his engineer, and his deckhand, they were all anxious to get back home. They hadn't heard anything of their family. This was the first storm that Captain Les had ever spent away from home. And as soon as we were secured to the dock, they were ready to go. And I said, "Wait a minute." I sent somebody down in the cabin to get that box of roses so he could take them to Miss Elsie, because I wanted him to take her the flowers. And sometime after they left and things settled down, I walked down into my cabin on the ship, and I looked, and there was a dozen roses sitting right where somebody had taken them out of that box and stuffed them. Later, when I talked to Captain Les, he said he was boiling up the sound in the tug Albemarle, going home. And after things settled down for him, he said he opened that box and saw that it was empty. And I can tell you, he never let me live that down.
just a couple more things on hurricanes.
Sure, Ed.
One of them, I don't know, I was probably about 10, and we were living in a different house than the one I just described. We were up close to, in fact, it's right in the middle of the, what would now be the parking lot for Village Marina. And again, it's one of these houses about yay high off the ground. Anyway, we have a storm, and my bedroom was on the northwest side of the house. And this is an old house. It's been moved to another area. It's scheduled for demolition now, but it was old then. And the windows were, particularly when it blew, they were shaky, and you didn't have anything near the quality of windows that you have today. Well, my bed kind of set in the middle of the floor about, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet from the window. When the wind comes real hard out of the northwest and it's raining very hard, all of a sudden it's flicking water in under the window and it's getting up on my bed, and I'm trying to sleep, and it's aggravating, so I abandon the bed and go into the front room with my grandmother, who was living with us at the time. And I go to sleep. And I don't know, sometime, it wasn't that late, but I don't know, maybe 11, 12 o'clock at night, my father comes in the room and says, "Ernie, I want you to get up, get up." I don't want to get up. "I want to show you something." There was no, "I want to show you something." And I'm saying, "No, I want to sleep. I'll see you in the morning." I was like 10 or so, and, being a, really cooperative 10-year-old. And he says, "Well, if you won't get up, you got to at least put 1 foot on the floor." So I do that. I stick that foot down in just about 6 inches of water. And the solution to that problem was to dry the foot off and go back to sleep. I mean, that was the kind of worry that was exhibited. My mother, into her latter years, and just one more piece for that, it was Emily. I decided to spend Emily, my parents were getting on in age a little bit. I guess my mother she would have been around 80. So my wife and I decided that we will stay in Hatteras. We had a house there as well, and I was going to need to worry about bait and for our charter business and taking care of the house. It didn't look like it was going to be that bad a storm. And that was the one that, as far as the press was concerned, it was no big deal. It got about 30 miles just kind of east-northeast of Cape Point, and just kind of stopped and pumped that north wind on the Hatteras for seemingly forever. Anyway, the tide's coming up, and my folks' house was built on the side of the old house, the one with the stoppers. And my father built it up where he thought it would be high enough, and the old cistern that we used to have was still behind the house, so you had a reference point. And the tide keeps coming up, and finally I said, "Daddy, have you ever seen the tide get this high? Has it ever been over that cistern before?" And he says, "Not to my knowledge," and he went back a ways. Well, fine, now the tide's up, and it's in the house about yay much, so you're sitting here in the house with about 1 inch of water. And the thing that was interesting, my mother did get irritated. And her problem was, we're all looking at to see what's going on, and she had served dinner and was irritated because we were not that anxious to sit down and eat. And that was pretty much the way things worked with her. So that's kind of my experience with hurricanes. In all seriousness, certainly the stuff that we're having and the damage that occurs, and when you do get older, and you have the boats and you have the responsibility, it's just not a matter of waiting to go out and play along in the marsh anymore. And there is a certain level of anxiety, and Isabel certainly brought that home in the village of Hatteras.
Yep. Thank you, Ernie. I'm just going to open it up to any comments or any stories anyone's brought that they wanted to share tonight that may be either off topic or anything. Biff, do you have any?
I get one rolling. I'm real privileged to be up here with these guys because they've been lucky enough to be here all their lives and grow up in this incredible environment. And I'm a newbie. I feel like an infiltrator and just a lucky guy at the party who didn't pay to get in. So I'm enjoying myself out here enormously for 20-some years, but my introduction to sailing was kind of a rude awakening. I know, these fellas have been on the water all their lives, and whenever I get in the water, I like to get in a bass boat and turn the key and go, and get up the creek, catch fish, and go, and put her on a trailer and go home. That's my idea of a good day on the water. But a friend of mine, and I think everybody's got a friend who is an adventurer in their own right. Some of them may not have come from the Outer Banks, but they was destined to end up here. And I used to have a buddy named Rob, and if Rob went to the grocery store, there was a story there. There was going to be a bigger story, and it was going to grow with some time. And then I found out that most of these were for true. Well, one day Rob invited me to go sailing. And I said, why do I want to get on a boat without a motor? That just seems totally silly and counterproductive to me. And can you fish? He says, well, no, you don't fish off a sailboat, and it's got a motor. It's about this big. Well, that don't sound like a lot to me, but okay. He says, well, we're going racing this weekend. I said, who's this we, Kimosabe? He says, you and me. All right. So we'll go out and practice. So the day we're scheduled to go out and practice, Tuesday or Wednesday before the race, it's blowing, I don't know, 30, 100, 200. It's blowing a lot of miles an hour out there. So we get out there on the boat, and I've never been on a sailboat. In my life, I've never been on a sailboat, so I am totally useless. And he starts calling out these terms, grab the halyards and grab everything. I have no idea. Well, the wind's blowing so bad, I think he pulls a handkerchief out of his pocket and rigs that up, and that's about all the sail we got up at the moment. Then that boat's leaning over about like this, and I'm trying to remember my best from the America's Cup. And I'm leaning way back on that uphill side, trying to imagine how you do this if you know what you're doing. And looking at Rob with his silly grin on his face and going, maybe that's it. You just ignore everything. And we managed to get her into port. And I said, well, this could be fun. So Saturday morning, I jump in my boat, which is behind the house, and turn the key, and boom, I motor over to Rob's boat. And tie mine up and get in his boat. And he starts that little teeny motor, which was just so cute, sitting on the back of that sailboat. And we puttered outside the harbor. Now, I don't know if any of you sail down here, but there used to be a boat that was an identical clone of the African Queen from the old movie. I think they called it the Collington Queen or something like that. And that was a committee boat for all the sailboat races we had down here. So we go out, and there's probably 30 or 40 sailboats milling around of mixed lineage out there. And we're hoping for something to happen because the wind's blowing at least 2 knots. At least 2 knots. So they scheduled us for 4 races, and the first one we're supposed to run up from Collington to Currituck Bridge. And we said, well, it's short run, that'll get me going. He says, it'll be a breeze today, you won't have anything to do. I said, good. What was that about a breeze? Yeah, it was nothing about a breeze. About 45 minutes later, we made it from Collington up to old Kitty Hawk Bay, which if any of you know that, that's about a couple of miles. So we're in this little pack of people, and people are swimming back and forth from boat to boat, trading beers for sandwiches. Who's got ice? I got a baggie. And I see how commerce got started on the Outer Banks, because it looks like a bunch of pirates escaped from Food Lion out there, swimming around with little baggies in their teeth, trading what you need for what you don't have, and we're just resigned to have a good time that day. And about that time, here comes this motorboat. Nice motorboat. And it has a officer of the law in it. And he decides that he hadn't seen our permit. Nobody's told him we're having a sailboat race today. So he's going to talk to us all. So he blows right through the middle of the pack. Well, the front half of all the boats now are moving about 2.5 miles an hour. And all those that are behind him now we just come to a dead screeching halt right there in the water. The sails go flat, and he starts to go on boarding boats. He's writing people tickets for crooked letters. I mean, he's checking absolutely everything on there. Well, of course, everybody's got a radio, and they're pretty anonymous. So after about 10 minutes of having his lineage questioned, his heritage had come under serious fire. his looks, his boat handling ability, and everything else had come under some serious disregard from everybody there. He's raging on somebody who's standing there with his mic keyed open so we can all hear this fella. And the guy drops the key, and somebody gets in the first word. Butthead. That officer grabs that mic, keys it open, and says, "Who said that?" Everybody in every boat all around the bay goes, "Right here." Right here. So he fumes and fusses and gives us grief and decides to go harass the committee boat. We said, "Oh, what the heck. Let's all go back. We ain't going to make it up there anyhow." So we regroup and they decide, well, we got time for one race today and we're going to race from Collington over to Michoud's Light, which you can see from Collington. It shouldn't be a big deal. Should be a fairly easy run. About 2.5 hours later. And this was back when we all smoked cigarettes. You know, we all did it once upon a time. I'm sitting up on the front of the boat, and I finish a cigarette, and I pull another one out and light it from the butt, and I throw the butt overboard. And I smoke about a half a cigarette, and I go downstairs, get a couple of sandwiches out, open a couple of beers, bring them up, and give them to Rob, set mine aside, take a last drag off that cigarette, and toss it off the back of the boat, right next to that other cigarette butt, right by the back of the boat. In the time it took me to smoke a cigarette, we'd moved 23 feet. I'm thinking this is not the most fun I've ever had in my life. Well, we're in a knot of 3 boats stuck in the back, and the other ones act like sort of they know what they're doing, but I know what they're doing. They got people swimming in the water and pushing them. We round Michoud's Light and start heading for home, and I notice that Rob is ever so gently taking that tiller and going back and forth with that tiller. I know he doesn't need the exercise. I've seen his arms. And slowly, over the course of the next couple of hours, we managed to separate ourselves from those last 2 boats. I'm looking at my watch, and it's coming up on 5. It's supposed to be the whole day's over at 5 o'clock. And that committee boat's about over there in the corner of the building. And it's coming up past 5. And I know they're supposed to all be over. And I look behind me, about a half mile behind, there's 2 other boats out there, and they're not moving a bit quicker than we are. We're all just oozing in and praying. And as soon as our bow line crossed the back end of the committee boat, they pulled out the horn and it was the end of the day. And I sure wish that they'd had a starter pistol and we could have called it a mercy killing. And I've never been back out on a sailboat.
At least the food was good, right?
I don't know who made it, but it was excellent.
Yeah, we can do that. Do we have questions from the floor?
God, y'all are great.
Can't believe you have no questions.
This is not a question, this is just about your sailboat. My father-in-law took me out of racing similar to what you're talking about, not knowing before. But what I can remember most is Becom, and we would lay over the side of the boat watching the jellyfish swim past us.
Question for Danny. We have a picture at the, a photograph at the Outer Banks History Center that I believe he took, don't know when. Just wondered if I describe it, if you can fill any gaps for us. We keep it in the office area above our staff calendar, and it just gives us all a hoot every time we look at it. It's a horse with a saddle on it in front of a gas pump. Does that ring a bell?
Absolutely. My daddy became good friends with ACOG. Every time they caught a big fish, ACOG was like, "Blessed fathers, I ain't got time to run down to Hatteras again." And so he talked to my dad. My dad said, my dad was a shutterbug, and said, "Sure, I'd love to take pictures for you." And Daddy really was. My daddy first visited the Outer Banks in 1937. He was jazz musician. He played upright bass for the Johnny Long Orchestra. This was back in the heyday of the big bands and stuff, and they did summers at the Cavalier. It's still there now, but they had some bad weather set in, so they were able to come down the Outer Banks for about 4 days. And that he was sold on the Outer Banks at that point. He got drafted into World War II and then came down here fishing after he retired in 1960. I had just been born. And my Aunt Doris from Durham, North Carolina, was down here with her husband. They'd been coming down here, taking Captain Toby Tillett's ferry across down to Hatteras. And so Uncle Bob said, "Ray, why don't you, I know you just got back from Vietnam here, why don't you go on over and see if you can catch something?" Well, Daddy, after 15 minutes, caught a 44-pound channel bass, so he was hooked on this place and drugged my mother down here, kicking and screaming the whole way. She knew that we were going to Florida, but Daddy after that was sold on this place. But and I still got some of his pictures taken in the 30s. I got a picture of Jockey's Ridge. I got a picture of Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, actually what was left of it at that time. But Aycock got Daddy to shoot pictures, and Daddy would shoot pictures of everything. A fellow named Buddy McDaniels found a 6-foot rattlesnake and killed it back in the woods, and people, said, well, they don't have, they got cottonmouths down there, but they don't have much of nothing else. Let me assure you, we got the copperheads and we got the rattlesnakes. He would take all sorts of odds and ends. But this fellow named Jeff Nyes was down there. I believe he might live over in Wanchese these days. But he had a horse, and he would ride the horse up and down the highway. I mean, he was nothing he'd love better than getting in the southbound lane on a Saturday afternoon when they were coming to check in their cottages. And that horse was not going to gallop. The horse's name was Zeus, and it wasn't because he was speedy. But Jeff was all the time doing things like that, and he'd come by the gas station, and he would purposely tie that horse up by we didn't have unleaded gas yet then, but he would purposely tie that thing up there where you could see. I mean, gas back then was 44 cents a gallon or something, which was highway robbery at the time. But he would always say, he'd look at one of these fellas come down there and they're brand new, pickup trucks and everything, and he'd just look over there real subtly and go, $8,000 cheaper. That was 1974, right in the middle of right as the onset of the gas crisis. Yeah. I got a quick story, Horace, if I can go.
Go right ahead.
I know you guys have been down to Ocracoke. I love Ocracoke. I think every Hattersman secretly wishes he lived in Ocracoke. And there's a lot of similarities between the two. Actually, from 1728 to 1846, Hatteras and Ocracoke were connected. So that's why a lot of the names are the same. The O'Neills and the Williamses and the Austins, a lot of those old Hatteras names, the Odins and the Midgets and stuff, they're interchangeable in Hatteras and Ocracoke. Excuse me. But the story goes that a Hattersman got in his old fish truck and went down to Ocracoke here, it had been too long ago, to visit his cousin there, and they hopped in the truck and they rode out to South Point. I don't know if any of you have ever been out on South Point, the very south tip of Ocracoke, but it's one of the most beautiful vistas we have on the Outer Banks. I mean, on a clear day, you can see Cape Lookout Lighthouse down there. You can see the housetops there on Portsmouth Island. You can see up just an awesome view. And they were catching a lot of fish that day. I mean, you had Ohio plates out there. This was in the fall. Pennsylvania plates, and all these fellers were out there fishing, catching a lot of red drum, which interchangeably channel bass, red drum is the state saltwater fish. But any of you, Cap Murney, every Hattersman has got an ego when it comes to fishing. There's nobody that can fish any better than a Hattersman, unless you're from Ocracoke, in which case you're better. So these two got out there, and they're sitting there in the fish truck, and the Hattersman and the Ocracoker, and this fellow, Virginia Plates, rolls in just a beautiful, gorgeous channel bass, about 35 pounds. It's beautiful fish. The birds are working. It's a nice sunny day. Those of y'all that know what the fall's like here, that's just, the light is just gorgeous, the way it dances on the water and everything. So the Hattersman, being clearly a gamer, says, looks at his cousin there from Ocracoke and says, "You'll never guess what I caught out here last weekend, pal." And the Ocracoke said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I know that world record channel bass was caught by that feller up there at Rodanthe, 82 pounds, but I guarantee you the one I caught probably run about 120, maybe 125 pounds. And the Ocracoke said, "Yeah, liar, they don't even get that big." And the Hattersman said, "I'm telling you, it was a gorgeous fish." And not only that, I let him loose and caught him again 20 minutes later on the same bait, and he fought harder the second time. The Ocracoke said, "That's just plain lying." And the Hattersman said, "Well, you can believe it you want, but I'm telling you it's true." So the Ocracoke sat there for a few minutes, and somebody else reeled in another nice channel bass, and the Ocracoke said to the Hatter's counterpart there and said, "You'll never guess what I caught out here a couple of weeks ago." And the Hattersman was ready for this, and he said, "Oh yeah, what's that, Buck?" And the Ocracoke said, "Well, I didn't catch no 125-pound channel bass that there ain't no such thing of, but I was rolling a little flounder rig off the bank over here, and I felt a little tug on my line, and so I reeled it in, and on the end of my line was a lamp." And the Hattersman said, "You caught a lamp?" And the Ocracoke said, "Yes, I did, and that's not all. I flipped the thing upside down, and it had written on the bottom, I've still got it, it's over the house. It had written on the bottom of it in real old scripty letters, it said, 'Captain E. Teach, Sloop Adventure, 1718. And the Hattersman got it thinking, either he's lying, or I know good and well Blackbeard lost his head about a half mile from here. He might be telling the truth. And the Hattersman said, "Really?" And the Ocracoke said, "Yeah, and that ain't all. It had a candle in it, and the candle was still lit." About that time, the Hattersman, he went all in. He said, yeah, that is lying. Your mother brought you up better than that." And the Ocracoke said, "Well, I'll tell you what, pal. You knock about 55 pounds off of that channel bass, and I'll run home right now and blow out that candle."
I'm sure there's plenty of questions here. Everybody just doesn't know where to start. I remember in the early 90s, I think the DOD had a series that ran on Sundays. It was a oral history of the casino. And they started talking about an incident at the casino. It was one of those busy Saturday weekend nights. And there was one of those convoys got in trouble, was fighting, and the police officer called the scene. Donnie Twan was the police chief at the time. They ended up chasing this boy after Jockey's Ridge. And, well, he just outran him. They just said, "Well, we'll leave him up there, we'll get him later when he comes back down." Well, when the boy came back down, he thought everybody was gone. He comes in there in the parking lot, get in his car and leave. But what did happen was the police were all scattered on when they caught him. I was telling this oral history to the fellow I used to work for down at the Waterworks in Nags, that was Bill Merritt. Recently he passed about a year or so ago. I started telling him his story, and he looks at me and says, "That was me." And he told me the story. He said he had been going to school in East Carolina. He'd been playing football. He was in good shape. He just got in some little incident or discussion over a girl or something. There was a fight, and then the police came. He just ran out the hill. He was telling me it was him. So I'm sure you guys must have some sort of story about the casino or maybe the Nags Head Club used to be just south of there.
Ernie?
Not really, because when I was growing up, you couldn't get back on the island after dark. The ferry shut down at dark. So we didn't ever do any horrible things like that.
But I bet you did something.
Well, for amusement. When I was growing up in Hatteras, and there was, just as today, there's nothing to do on the Outer Banks for kids. So back then we had to create our own activities. We did have a theater in Hatteras, in the village. When I say Hatteras, I literally am talking about the village of Hatteras, not the island. And we had Austin School Theater, and it had a Saturday night movie and a Sunday matinee, but if you wanted anything else at any other time, you had to create it. And what we did primarily for entertainment in the summertime was shark fish. And at that time in Hatteras, you had a lot of pound net boats, and you also had a couple of long haul boats. And in both of these operations, you had what it's now called bycatch. In those days, it were just scraps. And they would bring the fish into the fish ash and cull out their catch, sorting out the different good fish to sell. And then the fish that could not be sold were put in fish boxes. And when they'd finished culling their catch, these fish were taken outside the harbor about 100 yards or so and just dumped. And on any given day, there'd be probably between 500 and maybe 2,000 pounds of these discards dumped back into the water. And what this did was provide a lot of food for a lot of sharks. And what we did for entertainment at night was go shark fishing. And the predominant species was the relatively harmless bull shark. We didn't know they were just sharks, and it turns out the bull sharks like people. But at any rate, that was the entertainment, and you could fish off the dock, and there'd be 5 or 6 guys fishing off the dock. But the best of it was just outside the harbor, in the middle of where what amounted to was 1,000 pounds of chum being dumped on a regular basis. And I would borrow Mr. Levin's skiff. He didn't know I was borrowing it, but if you put it back, and that was what is now about where the Hatteras Harbor Marina is. There was a little cut, called it a ditch, but it's a little cut just wide enough for the skiff. And you'd go up after dark. And I knew that my father was beginning to trust me when he would let me borrow one of the fishing poles. And he would do that kind of grudgingly, but it kind of meant that he thought I was at the point where I could kind of handle myself, and he'd let me take just one. And a couple of my buddies and I would borrow Mr. Levin's skiff. And it was a shove skiff. It didn't, so you pole with one, with one oar. And we would maneuver it on down, pick up the pole. We'd have a bonita or two from the charter fleet. And we'd go out to what we called the first light beacon, and we usually would tie up at the light beacon. And the deal was, when you hook the shark, and these were sharks, maybe 100 to 300 pounds. And the shark would take off, and you'd fight him, and you'd get him up, to the swivel, to the tip. Well, you can't really move a 300-pound shark with a paddle. So that what you would do then was you'd back off your drag and just paddle like hell to get in fairly close to shore. And if the shark really took off, then you'd throw over the anchor and hold and crank him back up, and then repeat the process until you finally got close enough where you're in like knee-deep water. And at that point, you get it. One guy, always at least 3 of you. One guy would grab the leader so you could tell where his head was, and the other guy would go around to try to grab the tail. and the plan, and you get it. You pull him up on the bank, and then seems kind of harsh now looking back at it. You'd find a piece of stump or something and try to club him. You could throw him on in. But it was kind of high adventure, and that was what we did for entertainment in Hatteras when you were a teenager growing up in the late 50s and early 60s.
And you prefer that to dancing to the hot nuts?
Hey, I got a quick part. I got a quick part.
Have at it, Danny.
All right. Y'all know Mac Midget. He was the Hatteras Island Commissioner. He died a few years ago. And the gentleman asked about the casino. Well, I'm sure you knew about Drafty Tavern over there where Pirates Cove is. But I remember I caught the tail end of that. You had to be 18 to drink, but I used to get in there when I was 16. And I was scared to death because, after about an hour, everybody was good friends. But after about an hour and a half, that's when the fights would start. And I remember doing a story for the Island Breeze, talking to Mac Midget about a night where I was in there, and Mac had gotten in a fight. Mac was a big boy. Everybody wanted to fight Mac because he was the biggest boy. if you could whoop Mac, then, you know, you were a legend. But anyway, I distinctly remember this guy breaking a pool cue across Mac Midget's back. And I talked to Mac here, it's probably 10 years ago, maybe a little longer. I said, Mac, what did you ever do about that? He said, I smacked him as hard as I could. And I said, well, how hard was that? He said, Couch, I smacked him so hard he fell down every day for the same time for 2 weeks. Now, Mac is not eloquent, as you know, but if you knew him, then you could coerce those kind of stories out of him. But, you know, I could just picture that fella just falling in a clump, you know, at, 8:15 every for 2 weeks.
I want to tell a story about my father's crab house. He had a crab house in Wanchese. It's called the Croatan Seafood, and a fish house right beside the crab house. And one of the best things that when he opened his business down in Wanchese was it got him out of the fields over in Currituck, Point Harbor. But he had just the most incredible crew that would hang out at the crab house. And a lot of kids grew up at his docks. But this particular day, he had this one fellow, he drank a great deal, and I'm going to call him Tommy. Tommy had gotten up early one morning, and he had swiped one of my daddy's boats, and he went out and he emptied every crab pot he could find. And he didn't put them in a box, y'all. He just dumped them right on the bottom of that boat. And Tommy never wore shoes. But Tommy had had so much to drink, he was kind of numb from the toes up. Well, Daddy went out looking, and all these crabbers started arriving to the docks. And I had gotten there early, and Acock was there. He was there to photograph a big fish that had big-eyed tuna that had just been caught. And I was standing beside Acock, and Acock said, well, James, that looks like your boat coming. Daddy spun around, and these crabbers had been arriving all through the morning going, we have a crab in our pot, and we had it full of bait, and I had no idea what the heck's the matter with that. It's no bait and there's no crabs. But Daddy spun around, he said, that is my boat. And it's coming. I was like, Daddy, it is coming towards the docks. It doesn't look like he's stopping. And Daddy shouted, that's Tommy. And it looks like he's been drinking. And all the other crabbers are gathering around. They said, James, he is loaded with crabs. There are crabs. Well, Tommy, y'all did not stop. Daddy was shouting, slow down, slow down. He had run Daddy's boat right up underneath that dock, full, wide open. And all you could hear was splat, crack, and going, damn, James, can you help me out from under here? Daddy's like, I'll help you out from under there. So these crabbers pulled the actual boat out, and Tommy laid flat on his back covered with crabs. They were hanging from his hair, they were hanging from his ears, they were everywhere. He jumps up and he says, I did good, James, I got you a mess of crabs. Daddy's looking at his boat while it's sinking, and he's like, yeah, you got it. And by then, all the other crabbers had got so excited who was going to get to Tommy first, because he was going to be their next crab bait.
Thanks, Lisa.
That duck cannon you were telling me about?
That was a one-shot cannon. That was another way when Dad and everybody were growing up through Currituck. They had this where they'd go out duck hunting, and they would pack the ducks in salt, and they would put them on the merchant's boat, and it would go up to Elizabeth City to go on a train or another boat up to Norfolk to be sold. And then the wares and the goods not only from the profit of the farm, but the ducks would come back in money, and it would be presented to, but they'd pack everything in barrels. And this particular gun, once it was incorporated, the whole community owned that gun. And they would pack this gun. This gun would fit the length of a boat. And they would carved duck decoys, and had a blind set up, and they'd set these decoys out. And this gun would be attached just off to the side. And it would take a boat to run the boat out, set the boat, and then once they got the ducks in, actually landed and seated in the water, they would ignite this cannon-like gun, and in one shot, it would kill 100+ ducks. And then they'd spend the rest of the day picking up the ducks, cleaning them, setting them, and packing them in the barrels. Well, there was a notorious or infamous duck hunting guide that said he was the best duck hunter in all of the Outer Banks. And people came from literally miles just so he could take them out duck hunting. And he also got himself, he really liked to drink himself, but he was really plowed this particular day. He decided he could run that gun all by himself. So he loaded the powder, and this is in the middle of winter. So for him to even attempt this was just totally crazy. But he took that gun and he set it. He launched his decoys, and what he did, he didn't have the second boat to separate him from the cannon. He actually crawled into that one-shot cannon boat and ignited that gun. And he loaded so much powder in it that the whole back of that boat blew completely out. And that gun would kick anyway, but when it blew the whole back of that boat out, it started sinking. And the whole community heard that gun go out, and they were like, who has got that gun out? Then they realized, oh my God, it was sinking. I realized this was their community cannon. This was somewhat of a livelihood going down into the Sound. When they finally got out, they got Mr. O'Neill, he was about, at that point, hypothermia had set in, and he was in serious trouble. So what had happened was they realized that they were going to have to cut the loss with the gun, but they gathered him up in the boat, and they realized we're going to have to try and save him. So when they went back to the duck blind to get the other boat to bring it in, they found his medicine, his whiskey. They went over to a neighboring island, which in the middle of Currituck County, there are several islands, and each one has a wonderful name attached for a very special reason. But on some of these islands, they had hunting cabins set up. And they took him immediately into this hunting cabin. They started a fire to try and get him warmed up, got his wet clothes off of him, and they proceeded to pour the rest of his whiskey into him. And he really had just a challenge to hang on. He had severe frostbite to his fingers and his feet, but he still announced that he was the best duck hunting guide Currituck ever had. And for the most part, everybody forgave him, and he was truly a very wonderful friend and of the family. So life went on, but they were just one cannon short.
Thank you, Lisa.
Any memories of the Pirates Jamboree? Anybody want to share?
I was looking at, I have some home movies. My folks had bought a movie camera, one that you'd wind up, and the film was so expensive you just go, because you couldn't really afford to run that thing. And I was looking at some of those literally last week, and the race, in particular, the beach buggy race in Hatteras just fascinated me because of the extent to which people were expected to be responsible for themselves. There was no law enforcement. There was no park service. There was no rescue squad. There was no emergency vehicle. Nothing. They had they created a racetrack between what's the name of it? It used to be the Atlantic View Hotel and the Beach Hills, just inside the Beach Hills. And watching the cars go around, with no restraining ropes and no one telling people to get back, and people running across the track during the race, which on the one hand was foolhardy, but on the other hand, it was really interesting to realize that everyone there expected everyone to be personally responsible for their own behavior. It was just a tremendous contrast. I mean, this isn't a funny story, but that was, in just looking at that, it was kind of amazing to recognize that everyone there was able to maintain themselves without hordes of people telling them what to do. A real change from the good old days.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? I'll allow one more brief story if anyone has one to tell.
I got one that kind of can touch on what Ernie's been on. I love going to Hatteras just to see the people and to hear people that have accents and whatnot. And my buddy Rob, the adventure guy, called one night and said, "You want to go fishing?" And I said, "Where?" He says, "Rodanthe." I said, "I'll check with the boss." So I went in and stuck my nose up to the mirror, and it fogged up, and I figured the boss had given me approval, so off we went to Hatteras. Now, I'm not going to tell you how his Jeep came to be about a half a Jeep. His pickup truck had no tail lights, no rear bumper. That was just a complete other adventure with Rob because everything was. But we went down to Rodanthe, and we didn't know what we were doing. And we got out there, and all we could catch was a beer buzz and dogfish. And we caught so many dogfish, it was just ridiculous. And we had all these little sharks there. And, you know, what are you going to do? Come home going, "Hey, I got little teeny sharks. I got baby sharks." Well, we decided to call it a night about 2 o'clock or so and save it for another day. Except the truck was stuck. Well, Rob being the veteran that he is of the Outer Banks, we each take a wheel and start letting air out. I said, "When do you stop?" He said, "When it looks about flat." I said, "All right." So we pretty much flattened all 4 tires. Got that thing rolling, pulled up to the ramp, pulled up to Island Convenience, who had no air. We're a long way from home. Long way from home. We got a cooler in the back that has no lid. A dog in the back that's been in the ocean most of the evening and managed to avoid our hooks. And a truck that's going to be good for 10 or 12 miles an hour before it self-destructs. So we pull out of Rodanthe heading home. And those familiar looking way back when brown county sheriff cars pulls up right behind us. And in terms of being personally responsible, apparently the 2 gentlemen involved thought that we were the evening's entertainment. So without so much as saying a word, they turned on that spotlight and played it all over the back of the truck. So we got a few beers in the front seat, and I'm not a big drinker, but Rob's saying, "You know, we need to get rid of this stuff." So we start getting rid of that stuff. And the police are following along, and about every 3 or 4 minutes, they'd shine that light on us again, and here comes this artificial moon all over the back end, and the dog would look at them like, "Huh?" And we continued, and they would not pass us. We got up to the P Island station there, and the horizon's all aglow. Now, you got to admit, this is way back, and I see an orange glow covering the horizon in front of me, and I go, "We got no Walmart on the Outer Banks. What's this all about?" And the police come up real close about then, just as we come over the hump, and we pick up a little speed on the downhill side. We're going maybe 15. And I swear, in my imagination, I could hear his faintest little chuckle coming from behind us from that vehicle. So we keep on rolling up, and we get to the Coast Guard station, Oregon Inlet, and there's a big glow all over the horizon. And get up onto the bridge and see the people who knew what they're doing up there on the catwalk fishing, and they probably actually catching fish. They had lights and knew what they were doing, and one of the things they knew what they were doing is staying in one place right about then. And we start coming up over the bridge, and God, the whole horizon is aglow like Hades has lit up the Outer Banks. And sure enough, they've done a marsh burn all up around, and it's jumped over from the campground to behind Pirates Cove, and it's up around the lighthouse, and as far as I can tell, the whole world's on fire. Well, my bladder probably put out about then, but we're coming down the hill, and these guys stopped playing the light on us, and I go, well, thank goodness. Because right in the parking lot at Oregon Inlet is gathered the assembled law enforcement, Park Service, and every other vehicle that has lights on it in Dare County. All of them go blue and red lights flashing everywhere. And another time you'd have said, well, this is really pretty. But right about then, we're not thinking it's so pretty. And we come by getting up close to the campground and thinking, well, we got to drive through this stuff. There's fire come up to each side of the road, and we're going to drive through it. And it's not like we're going to make a speedy run. We got 4 flat tires. So we're going to crawl through this thing. And just for giggles, whoever's in that car behind us turns on their lights and siren and comes running at us as fast as they could and turns right into the parking lot of Oregon Inlet. And I swear, there should have been 100 people sitting there in their cars with their lights on, just laughing at 2 idiots driving down the road in a busted Jeep at 2:30 in the morning with 2 dogfish in the truck.
Thank you, Biff. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Well, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I want to thank our guests here on stage. I want to thank our host, the National Park Service, for inviting us into this space that does have such historic value to lend to this great occasion. And I hope, too, that these sessions will become not only a regular part of the Land of Beginnings, but they'll certainly spark more interest in this type of event, so that because there are plenty of stories to share. But I think one of the things that we certainly can all acknowledge is that we just seem not to take the time to listen to them the way that we used to. So I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to listen to these stories, and I want to thank those of you who are sharing the stage with me. Thank you for being here and for sharing that part of your life with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.